So welcome everyone. I will be chairing this afternoon session. May I ask you as usual, but maybe for people who are just joining, to put any questions you may have in the chat, and we will then try and go through them at the end of the presentation. So let's have the first presentation, which is by Dumisani Chirambo, in pursuit of equity for climate refugees and climate migrants in the global south, implications for the Paris Agreement. I'm really looking forward to this. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yes, welcome everyone. My name is Dumisani Chirambo, and I'm making this presentation from Blantyre, Malawi. So I will be looking at the issue to do with climate refugees, why it's something that needs to have more prominence in the international climate change regimes, and how the Paris Agreement can actually be of support or can actually be of assistance there. So in my presentation now, basically first start with talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and how the climate migrants might actually derail plans or efforts to actually attain the Sustainable Development Goals in most African countries. Then I'll be looking at what has been proposed or what are some of the issues that or approaches that are being adopted to deal with climate migrants. And then I will come in the last segment again with my own argument as to why I think that the Paris Agreement could be the good foundation to actually bring equity for climate migrants. So the Sustainable Development Goals, we all deal with them in different forms. We know that they are interlinked and they affect our work as well as our projects and our strategies in different forms. But where I'm coming from is the issue to do with climate change. How is climate change affecting the implementation of the aspirations of the SDGs in different contexts? For example, if you look at disasters that are happening, they cost a lot in lives as well as infrastructure. That has an implication on government spending. And again, we've also got the issue where disasters can also exacerbate inequality. So what are the issues there? Where I come from in Malawi, it's a least developed country, and we usually have floods and droughts. And then that is again also affecting how the government is conducting its business. What we know is that with climate change, it's a form of injustice or inequality or inequity, because most of the impacts or the adverse impacts of climate change will be felt in countries that contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's that issue of climate justice. So I will come in again with my own issue on climate justice, where I'm coming in with the issue about refugees as well as internally displaced persons. When we look at the literature, some of the things that are coming up with that the international community needs to contend with or to confront when it comes to climate change is, how can we deal with large-scale migration? Again, when you've got migration, the reasons are many. It could be because of resource scarcity, or it could be because of the weather events. And again, you've also got an intensification of conflicts between states as well as regions. Again, it's because of things like food or water. You've got other people damming other people's water resources as water resources become smaller and smaller due to population as well as climate change. So again, those are the things that the international community has to contend with. And again, you've also got the issue of diseases. Where I come from, we are used to malaria, but in other countries where there's no malaria, a warmer climate means malaria might actually become an issue. But what I found fascinating, or where it is quite interesting when we talk about climate change, is about states that might actually disappear. When you look at small island developing states, increases in the water level might actually make those states to actually disappear. So what happens to those people? Because in the international climate law regime, or in the international law regime, countries are formed from other countries unifying or doing the cessations or even dissolution, but we don't have a circumstance where a country disappears and then you've got those people in that country to actually go in another country to have or to start their own country. So those are just things I thought that were quite interesting, from an academic point of view when we actually look at these issues. But of course, I'm digressing a little bit, but they are all interlinked. So why do I say that climate change induced migration and displacement are social dilemmas? Well, where we are, we have a growing number of people that will be affected by climate change. As you know, populations are increasing, and as well as the severity of disasters is increasing. But what we are actually seeing is that these sorts of conflicts or social disruptions are not covered for in legal frameworks. And I'll deal more with that when in the other slides when I talk about the legal frameworks, just like I am, interchangeably using climate refugees, which again is a misnomer because there is no such thing as a climate refugee, but I'll be explaining that as we go on. When we look at the issue of migration or displacement due to climate change, then we shouldn't just be looking at maybe the country or the source country, but you should look at also the transient countries as well as the recipient countries. So when I talk about that, I mean that we've got a flood in a country like Malawi, or what happened in Mozambique again, Cyclone Idayo, where it was Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique that were actually affected. Then you've got people moving from one region or one country, passing through another region, another country, and going to a destination country. So you can actually see that if it's done en masse and there are many people, then there'll be different social conflicts or even resource implications on all those three regions. And then if the people are not happy where they've ended up with, they might decide to be going back. And again, you've got that sort of mass transition or mass migration. So those are the kind of thinking that we should actually be looking at when I'm looking at this topic on migration and conflict, as well as looking at the equity which such people are provided with. So the numbers, of course, differ as to how many, when you're doing projections as to how many people will be affected or how many people will move or who is a climate migrant or who is just a migrant. But what is fascinating is that the numbers are increasing. All the projections show that, the number of people affected will increase. So for example, they have written that 36 million people were displaced by natural hazards related to disasters in 2009. I have also said there, but by 2050, up to 250 million might be displaced by climate change. So, the numbers, might not always tally depending on your source, but the projections always show that the number of people affected will be increasing. So what has the international community done so far? What are we doing, or what are my argument for this presentation is? Well, some people say that we should just extend the scope of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is what governs rules and regulations with regard to refugees, the conventional refugees that we're used to. I'll again talk about that later on. Others say that maybe we should create a new legal framework on refugees. For example, you saw in the previous slide where the numbers of people that might be displaced or might become refugees is increasing. So, the Geneva Convention, if you just extend it, it might not be sufficient. So why not just, create a new legal framework? Others say that we should add a new protocol on climate-induced migration. Most of you are aware, just last month, many people went to Scotland for the Conference of Parties. The Conference of Parties happens under the auspices of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So again, if you've got a protocol to the UNFCCC, then all the people that go to the Conference of Parties are going to follow what is in that protocol. And of course, other things are less complicated. For example, you can use temporary protection mechanisms when something happens. So for example, if people are affected by large-scale flooding, then they can go into another country, and then for that time, they are given some support as well as assistance. Then you've got planned relocation and resettlement, where I spoke about the small island developing states where, some of them might actually sink or might actually disappear. So, then people need to be resettled somewhere. Then number 6, where I talk about resettlement instead of temporary asylum. Of course, for now, right now, many countries are not very eager to actually make people that are displaced to become their citizens. So they just give them temporary asylum so that when situations are better, they can go back there. But the arguments are that, well, just make them resettle, because maybe if they go back, then it will become a trend or a cycle where something happens and they have to come back. Number 7, where I talk about international assistance for domestic measures, is again the issue where instead of waiting for, where the countries in the global north actually provide countries in the global south with more funding or more resources to actually deal with their climate-induced migration or to do with their refugee issues in the countries. So it's just a question of, providing more support to them so that they adapt better or that they create better conditions. And of course, number 8 is international burden sharing, where the more well-to-do countries actually take more refugees in. But what are the issues with some of these approaches? Well, most of the literature says that we are seeing more nationalism, a growth in nationalism, as well as a growth in anti-immigration. So that will actually mean that most governments might not be very willing to have more people come in when they're displaced by climate change. So again, that's another issue that requires more discussions, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention so that you should know why such things are quite complicated when you look at them from a global perspective. I did say that I was going to talk about the Geneva Convention. So when you look at the Geneva Convention, how it was framed, the main issues then were about war, or maybe political issues where people were not of the same political thinking, and then people had to go outside their country. So the Geneva Convention is framed to provide protection to people that move out of their own country. They can't be in the same country, and for issues such as race, religion, as well as political opinions. So if people move out of their country for reasons other than those ones, like for example running away from environmental issues or climate change, then you do not expect to have the same recognition, protection, and rights as that of which the convention refugees are accorded. And then that's the issue, or that's the main problem that we have right now. So, if you actually look at the issue of refugees, then you've got the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which again is struggling to provide support to about the 22.5 million refugees that are there. And again, with the projections that I gave you that, up to 200 million people might be classified as refugees by 2050, then you can see that the number of climate refugees might actually increase or be more than the actual number of conventional refugees, and then that just also brings about other sorts of complications for governance, as well as providing resources adequately. Where they've said that, okay, so this issue is something that warrants more attention. We're not going to look at it on a global perspective, like how the Geneva Convention is. We'll try to do something at our own regional scale. So you've got the Organization of African Unity, which has I've put in flag there, events seriously disturbing public order. You can actually argue that, climate change or environmental hazards are something that seriously disturb public order. If you look at the African Union also, they've got their Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons. Again, they actually put in there that natural or human-made disasters call for people or countries to actually unite together to give more protection to such people. And again, the internally displaced persons do not cross borders. So again, it's just the way that we should look at how the framing is done. And of course, you've got the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees. Again, that one is in the Americas, where again they've said that other circumstances which have seriously hampered, our communities. So the issue there, or the problems there, is that conventions are only binding on countries that sign them. So, for example, if it's the African Union, then it's going to be mostly African countries that sign the conventions, which is of the African countries might not have the actual resources to actually look after all those internally displaced persons or those refugees. So again, they would want some assistance from the international community. And if the international community is not a signatory to such commitments, then also it becomes problematic. So those are the challenges. From an academic perspective, again, not looking at policy as such, there was this model which I took from Ahmed 2018. Again, in their argument, they were saying that we know that most of the greenhouse gas emissions have been emitted by countries in the global north, for example, the United States of America. So they should be the ones who should be able to accommodate more or most of the climate migrants or climate refugees. And again, with that one in their model, which of course anyone can look at later on, they just say that, for example, America should take 10% of the total number of climate migrants or refugees that happen. So again, if you're looking at the 200 million, then they take about 20 million people, by 2050. So that's just, a model based on how much someone has contributed the most and then them taking more responsibility. Where I'm coming from is to do with the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement, or my suggestion or my argument was that, well, we've now got the Paris Agreement, which is very different from how the Kyoto Protocol was. In the Paris Agreement, again, it's countries which determine what they should prioritize in their national policies for climate change. And again, if we look at how they are framed, there is more scope to add other things. For example, in the Paris Agreement, countries produce nationally determined contributions, which just show their ambitions or their climate change policies or their programs or their focus areas. But what we have now, when the Paris Agreement was formulated in the first phase from 2015 to 2020, we saw that the countries did not reach the target which was set in the Paris Agreement for mitigation or greenhouse gas emission reductions to fall below the 2 degrees Celsius target. But what my argument finds very interesting or as an opportunity is where we're saying that, well, in the Paris Agreement or in the NTCs, we actually say that countries should actually be becoming more ambitious in 5-year cycles. They should be ratcheting up their actions or commitments. So what that means is that, yes, from 2015 to 2020, we did badly, but from 2020 to 2025, a certain country is supposed to actually show more ambition or to actually do more than they did previously. And then that brings about this opportunity where I was saying that when you're looking at increasing ambition, don't just look at increasing funding or actually increasing mitigation. Also look at the issue to do with looking at other less known aspects such as the empowerment of climate refugees. So that is an entry point, which I think is something that most countries or most policymakers should actually be looking at. That yes, let's argue that showing more ambition also means providing more resources to those that are least, those that have least resources. So the way to do it again is to introduce climate change displacement as a theme in all the themes that are in most entities are to do with maybe urbanization, population growth, and adaptation. But you can now include, the theme of climate change displacement, and you can also say that every African country will establish a fund for helping people that are displaced by climate change. And if all African countries actually do that, then the international community can also pour in some resources into that fund. So that is what I was talking about when I said we should ratchet up and increase more ambition, but more to do with climate refugees and internally displaced persons. So my concluding remarks is that, well, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are calling for different things like ending poverty, providing food security, and also into other things like, promoting safe migration, which is SDG 10.7, and also promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, SDG 16. But as you have seen from what I was trying to bring to your attention was that those things or these SDGs might not actually be possible unless we actually improve our climate change governance frameworks so that we can actually afford more protection to people that we informally classify as climate refugees, climate migrants, or climate displaced persons, because their numbers are increasing. And if you don't provide them with recognition or opportunities to work, then you've got, a recipe for disasters and more conflicts. And again, I said that, some people want, the climate change protocols, such as the UNFCCC, to actually have something on migration, but that could be more challenging. But we can use the Paris Agreement, as I've tried to explain, that, with the NTCs, it's a starting point, a foundation where, if all countries say that, okay, let's start talking about, the issue of migrants, then at the next COP or the next conference of parties, then you might actually see that more people will be actually talking about this. And lastly, African countries are likely to have a greater number of climate refugees. So it's actually up to the African countries in their NTCs to actually be talking about the issues to mainstream climate migrants. Right now, most of the European countries talk about climate change mitigation because that is something that is something that is in their control. It's something that affects their livelihoods. So it's up to actually us, here in the developing world, to actually say that our issue, or something that is more pertinent to our development trajectory, is the issue of recognizing climate migrants. Thank you. There ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Dumisani, for this very interesting presentation, and also for sticking to the time. I think we have time for one question. I see two questions from the same person. If I've been reading the first one, and I think it was asked early on and you've kind of addressed it already. So if it's fine, I will just read the second question, which came up later. So regionally, the African countries have stepped up in receiving refugees and IDPs, notwithstanding their very limited resources. To what extent is the continent's role in shouldering the brunt of migration taken into consideration in the dominant migration discourse in the global north? And shouldn't African recipient countries receive recognition and support rather than being blamed for the backlash of rising need for migration? You can read the question as well in the chat if you, because it's a threefold question actually.
No, I get the gist of it. But I think when you also look at migration, then the issue becomes more complicated, because you've also got the issue of normal migration where there's conflicts in other countries. And then you've got where I'm coming to say that migration is something that needs to be linked to climate change in some circumstances. So countries, or even the EU, has got projects on minimizing the impact of migration, where they actually try to give some countries funding so that they can create more jobs, and then that can actually make people not to cross the Mediterranean. But those are just the normal migrants. When it comes to climate change, that is not recognized, because that's what my argument was about, where I was saying that the international regime does not accept or does not acknowledge that people are actually moving because of climate change. Because if they do that, then they might have to pay more money, or they might have to support more people. So if someone says, okay, I'm going to cross the Mediterranean because climate change has affected my country in such and such a way, it becomes more complicated. But there are international programs run by the Global North, which try to address the root causes of migration, such as unemployment and skills development. And they actually happen to most of the countries in the North Africa, I think, where people are migrating to Europe, but they don't recognize climate change as a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think you can discuss much more about it, perhaps in the next coffee break.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I think we have to move on to the next speaker now. I will now give the floor to the last speaker of this session, and that is Charlotte, whose sound should be fixed by now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think I can share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead. I already announced the paper you would be presenting, so go ahead, the floor is yours.
Is it in presenter view?
Yeah, it's perfectly fine.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present here at this conference. My name is Scheerens. I'm Operational Manager of Climate Health, an international academic network on climate migration and health, and also postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University and involved in research at Harvard Medical School. Today I'm going to present results from an exploratory study we conducted in 2019 on family physician perceptions of climate change, migration, health, and healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa. So to give a little bit of the background, why we did this study, increasingly, and actually now during 2020, more than 30 million people, which many in sub-Saharan Africa, also regions in Asia, were driven from their homes by multiple extreme weather conditions, often very linked to the local situation. And this leads to multiple patterns of migration, which often has adverse health outcomes for the communities at risk. And we see that especially in regions with low capacity and access to health services to support health needs from migration and/or climate change. And still in the current literature, the health and the healthcare angle specifically in climate migration research is still underexplored, not yet well understood, and is highly contextual and depending on the local context. Likewise, we also see that there's still a big need to explore adaptation and mitigation measures. For example, also seen in the fact that there was only this year for the first time a health pavilion at the Climate Summit. So, and many of these adaptation measures nowadays focus on integrating all different kinds of sectors that have a link with health to eventually build more climate resilient, migrant inclusive health systems, basically health systems that can adapt to the new challenges related to climate change and migration. And family physicians and in general primary care providers can actually play an important role here. They can both provide insights to how they see the nexus, where they see the main adverse health outcomes and what the role of healthcare is. And it can also provide valuable insights into adaptation measures related to these more robust and resilient health systems. And we draw this hypothesis from the fact that they're, as family physicians, they're community-oriented. They're also generalists. They have no specialization in healthcare. And they're often seen as the entry point for the population's interaction with the health system. And depending on the country, it's often family physician, but can also be other primary care providers, such as think of nurses, midwives, even pharmacists, and so on. And so with our research team, we tried to make a synthesis of previous literature and evidence on this climate migration, health and healthcare nexus. And what was actually novel in our study is that we specifically added healthcare in this nexus, whereas previous research mostly looked at the dynamics between health, climate, and migration. And so you see that climate change actually has a direct impact on health, but also migration. And then there's an important interplay with health services. And so we use this framework also to basically develop topic guides for 3 focus group discussions with the aim to explore family physician perceptions on mechanisms in the nexus and also on this intersectoral capacity building. adaptation, specifically focusing on the sub-Saharan Africa region. And so during 2019 WONCA Africa conference that was held in Uganda, we organized 3 focus groups, and on the left you can see a map where most of our participants were from. Obviously, that was mostly from East Africa, given the location of the focus group discussions. But we had a good spread of more than 12 countries represented. We transcribed them all. They were transcribed by residents from the region. And then we analyzed them using an inductive thematic approach. And I think it's good to say that the research team consisted of researchers from Africa and Europe, so to allow correct representation. And we had also a very interdisciplinary team with researchers from health science, economics, and bioscience. And going immediately to the results, so using the quotes that the participants gave in the focus groups, we tried to basically map all these results and try to connect them and see what are the main topics that emerged. And we basically saw that the things they said regarding climate change, migration, and health were very complex, and all the aspects kind of influence each other and reinforce each other. And we coined that continuous feedback loop mechanisms, where many of the stories were about migration, either related to climate change or to seeking better health and or healthcare, and health impacts related to climate change or to migration, and the role of healthcare in there. And that then often led to an accumulation of health risks, more migration patterns, and often more disrupted health services. And there's this interplay with socioeconomic and ecological determinants of health, and also a broad demographic and political context. And we tried to map them then in this visualization. And the idea behind this was to actually draw lines and connections between all the topics that were mentioned. And as you can see, the bigger the arrows, the more often this interaction was mentioned by our participants. And so basically, we have the 4 dimensions of the nexus, and in the middle, you see all the determinants of health and the environmental determinants, and also the context that often played a role in how climate change affects migration, health, and the role of healthcare. And to make this a bit more concrete, I will give the example of Cyclone Idai and forced displacement, which this was a tropical storm that ravaged Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe in early 2019. And it was coined one of the worst weather-related disasters in the Southern Hemisphere, with a combination of drought caused by El Nino, which was then also intensified by climate change. And it set in motion a cycle of events. Huge amount of homes and crops were destroyed. People had to leave their houses immediately. There was a lot of forced displacement. Mortality was very high, and a lot of different diseases emerged. I'm going to read a quote from a family doctor in Mozambique that explained a little bit what happened, and will also make clear how everything is interconnected in the nexus. So he starts saying with, we've had cyclones before, but this one was really horrific. What pains me is that the government did nothing about warning people to move to higher, safer grounds. The cyclone struck down the roads and people's houses were swept away overnight. Some communities vanished completely and bodies could not be retrieved. There was a lot of anxiety, depression amongst relatives in these countries that already have very weak health systems. To help those people was not easy. We have a high prevalence of HIV. Some whose homesteads were swept away did not have access to their antiretroviral medication. The government took too long to respond. People did not have access to clean water, which means a whole lot of waterborne diseases coming from that place. In fact, they saw 1,420 cases of cholera were notified due to the cyclone. And my main worry is it is going to take a long time before the infrastructure is repaired and the clinics are revived. What if another catastrophe hits the same area? You can imagine people migrating from that region to another one. How is that health system going to cope? There will be infectious diseases arising from that. And we have lost a lot of doctors. Also, they leave the country to look for greener pastures. So this was one case that was explained. And here you see some numbers from an external source, the amount of people that were affected, huge number of people displaced, and more than 800 people died. And so if we map all the aspects that were mentioned in only that one story, you can, here I draw the lines in red on our visualization. You can see how interconnected all the dimensions are in the nexus and how difficult it is to draw unidimensional lines and see a unidimensional structure. So, and then the second part of our research was on where adaptation opportunities lie, and especially how different sectors can work together. And so there were 5 main topics that emerged from the data. First is on multidimensional, multi-layered governance structures between local, national, international levels. A lot of input on improving family physician training to get them more acquainted with the topics of climate change and migration and the impact on health, and also improving primary healthcare working conditions so brain drain is lower. There's also a big responsibility from high-income countries to not attract always all the workers from low and middle-income country regions. Huge part on health advocacy in primary healthcare towards the community, towards policymakers, towards other sectors. More collaboration with health sector and civil society and NGOs. There was mention of, for example, NGOs that are involved with planting trees, and that family doctors can also highlight this and work together with this in the community. And then more responsibilities for high-income countries in supporting this, especially providing funding and facilitating programs to make this happen. And then we also asked specifically on the role of family physicians. And in this figure, you could see all the opportunities for this capacity building we mapped on different levels. So on the top, you can see this is more about foreign relations and organizations. Then we have actions for the national government, then also the organization of the healthcare sector, and individual empowerment and action for family physicians, which is really about more active participation in different forums about solutions. As I say, advocacy, also provide more preventive and curative services, education and public awareness, and also work on an integrated development agenda. And I think the key messages from our research are eventually that we think it's really crucial to involve family physicians from this region more in research on the nexus, both as participants and as researchers. Because from our study, we saw they provide really rich and comprehensive insights to the nexus. They themselves sometimes, but especially their patients, have really lived experience of migration. There are still some difficulties for family physicians from our sample to really identify the difference between what is climate change, what is an impact of climate change, what is rather environmental pressure. Therefore, it's also important to develop their capacity and also their research capacity to generate more evidence on social environment determinants of health and all the implications of climate and migration. There's a big need for support to boost this by the high-income countries. And it might be important to also extend this to other primary care professionals, as I said in the beginning of this presentation. Then the next key message is to really embrace complexity. The nexus is not a unidimensional structure. For example, the role of healthcare was very complex. It's both a driver but also is impacted by migration and climate change, and plays a big role in its ability to support health impacts. So we actually need more non-conventional research methods to really do research that kind of represent the reality. And so we can think about methods such as complexity theory, complex adaptive system theory, that really embrace this non-linearity. Then some more key messages was to mainstream the nexus and training curricula of family physicians. A lot is happening right now on education of primary care and planetary health, and this can really fit into such curricula. And it's really about connecting topics such as emergency planning, communicable disease control, with information and knowledge about what is forced displacement, what is refugee health, what does losing your homes mean. Also focus on domestic and occupational environmental pollution. There's a big aspect of mental health, personal security, substance abuse. That was often mentioned in our quotes, that also should find its way into training and curricula, and also be linked to climate change and migration. And then, of course, also about gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health. And then again, really family physicians and primary care professionals as advocates in emergency planning and preparedness committees. They should really be involved there so we can anticipate better and protect the needs of the communities at risk. And eventually governance. There's an opportunity to use the Primary Healthcare Performance Initiative connected with the WHO Framework for Climate Resilient Health Systems to really develop an integrated development agenda and connect the local and the international level. And I think this is it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. I see one question in the chat. Climate change healthcare nexus, did your research have overlaps with the One Health framing as a way of addressing complexity on the ground? Is the question. You can also see it in the chat.
Oh, so if your research have overlaps with the One Health framing, we did not use the One Health or the planetary health perspective as in our research design, and but I think there's definitely overlap if you look at the figure that we developed, and also given the fact that our research team was highly multidisciplinary, so we had perspectives coming from the different disciplines and looking at this from different angles. So I think implicitly the One Health or the comprehensive approach was there, but we did not explicitly implement it in our design. But I absolutely agree that this is the way forward, and it can also be an approach that will help to design or to find methods that adequately can explore and study issues in the nexus.
Okay, and then there's a second question that appeared. I think we can still have a look. So could global, like a broader approach, address migration challenges or issues as you demanded of using non-conventional use to address migration issues? Not sure what is meant with a more global approach to address these migration challenges. I guess I'm interpreting this as more international collaboration to deal with this nexus, but feel free, David, if you had another stance to clarify it in the chat.
I could be wrong, but are you referring to the fact that given migration has international implications, often that this actually needs a global approach where countries work together instead of looking at this within one country. If that's the case, I think I can agree with that. There's quite some parallels to also draw with with the current pandemic. It doesn't stop at the border. You actually need you need an international response to this, and I think that could be a good approach to look at this. Where is migration coming from? What are the destination countries? As I said, for example, with brain drain, we see a lot of health workers leaving, especially rural areas, in settings where the working conditions are not ideal, payment is lower, and a lot of countries in the north are really attracting health workers with better working conditions, better pay, and that has consequences for the regions where they're coming from. And that would already be one aspect that really needs a global approach and needs more focus on health equity and equity in health systems as well. I think similar things are to be seen right now with how the vaccinations are being distributed. There's a lack of equity in how we approach these global issues. And I think if we are going to do the same with what we're seeing now with climate migration, eventually the regions that are hardest hit will see the least solutions to this.
Okay. Regional global approach as you're trying to address. All right, so thank you to the speakers. Thank you also to the people asking questions in the chat and sending all the thumbs. So I think we can leave it here. And so we'll be listening first then to Robin Jilesen on climate change and migration to South Africa, exploring the role of climate and environment-related adversities in mobility decision-making.
Yes.
So
you can all see my presentation now?
I can see it, and now it's full screen, so it's perfect. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Robin Jilesen. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk today about a study that I conducted last year as part of my master's degree in development studies at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. And the title of the thesis that I wrote was Climate Change and Migration to South Africa, Exploring the Role of Climate and Environment-Related Adversities in Mobility Decision-Making. So let me just give a very short introduction. As everyone here is most certainly aware, climate change is a massive issue of concern, both among policymakers as well as researchers. And in particular, the links between climate change and migration are actually a topic that have received quite a lot of attention in popular discourse. The strange thing about it, though, is that despite the fact that this has received quite a lot of attention in popular discourse, there's actually a surprisingly little research that has been conducted on this topic. It's actually a very under-researched topic, specifically in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, and most definitely in the case of South Africa. So this is actually what my study has looked at. It was a qualitative study capturing in-depth experiences of 20 migrants, mostly undocumented and low-skill and pretty poor migrants. Most of them were actually from Zimbabwe and Malawi, and a small number were from Nigeria, the DRC, Ghana, and Mozambique. I also looked into the experience and perspectives from a number of key informants. These were people from academia, NGOs, and several multilateral organizations, as well as perspectives from literature. I gathered information from these key informants and the migrants through semi-structured interviews, looking into migrants' experiences before, during, as well as after migration. So I wanted to find out what were the conditions that people were facing back home, what were the difficulties that they were facing, how did they deal with that, how did they actually come to the decision to migrate, what role did environment play in that, and then also during migration, what kind of things did they go through. after migration, how did they settle, what were the challenges they faced, and how did they deal with those things. And I'm going to touch upon a few of those things today. Let me see. Yeah, actually, I must say though, for the sake of time, I'm going to mostly focus on the factors that actually drove migration to South Africa, and a little bit less on descriptions of people's experiences during and after migration. I did write about it, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk too much about those last two things. The key question that guided the research, it's quite a mouthful, but bear with me. What roles do climate and environment-related stresses play in mobility decisions among sub-Saharan African immigrants now residing in South Africa's Gauteng province? And how do these environmental migration drivers relate to other non-environmental drivers? Let me just give a little bit of context about the research area. So, as you heard in the research question, the study actually was conducted in Gauteng province in South Africa. Gauteng is the smallest province of South Africa in terms of service area, but it's also the most economically prosperous province in South Africa. It is, you could say, the economic heart of the country. It's home to two of the main cities in the country: Pretoria, which is one of the three capitals and also seat of the president, and Johannesburg, which is, I think, the largest city in the country, and certainly one of the economic hearts, I think, together with Cape Town. And because of the economic position of Gauteng province, it's also an important location for migrants from other African countries to move to. Here you see a close-up of Gauteng province, again with Johannesburg and Pretoria. And there's one location that I actually want to mention, that is Mooiplaas. You can see it here. Mooiplaas is an informal settlement. The name Mooiplaas is Afrikaans. It means beautiful farm. I imagine it used to be farmland in the past. Now it's an informal settlement, so it's basically a slum. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because the majority of migrants that I spoke with as part of the research lived in this location. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about it, just so everyone has a bit of an idea what kind of place this is. So here are a number of pictures of Mooiplaas. On the left side, you can see a picture of the central market square. There's no market going on right now in the picture, but usually there are daily markets. This is where people tend to buy most of their necessities. You can see a rubbish heap. There's lots of them all over the place because the government does not actually collect rubbish. People in this area are very poor usually, and there are almost no government services. So as I said, rubbish isn't collected. There is no drinking water. No running drinking water, that is. There's no electricity, no sewage system, etc. I think many of you are probably familiar with similar places across the African continent. And the reason I'm also talking about this is because this is quite emblematic for the types of locations where a lot of poor and undocumented immigrants in South Africa tend to end up in. On the right, you can see a place where people can buy food. It's like a small food stall. Here a picture of a typical street. Obviously it's unpaved. And here a picture that I took inside one of the houses. Yeah, most people here tend to live in makeshift dwellings made of corrugated iron. I'm going to talk a little bit about the term climate and environment related migration before I delve into the research results. You might have heard this word when I mentioned this in the title and also in the main research question that I used. It's quite a mouthful, not the most practical term, but there's a very specific reason that I'm using it. And to explain it, I'm going to give a little bit of context on the debate around the climate environment migration nexus in the last few decades. If we look at this debate, which started in maybe the late 1980s, early 1990s, we can basically see from very early on that two different camps started to form. These were on the one side the maximalists and on the other side the minimalists. The maximalist narrative is quite well known in popular culture, popular discourse, and it's basically the idea that due to climate change is basically inevitable that worldwide millions of people are going to have to go on the move. They will be displaced by climate change. We can expect climate refugee crises. The whole swaths of the planet will become unlivable and people will be forced to move away from those areas. Now, even though that is not entirely impossible that that's going to happen. It might very well happen. There are some problems with this narrative, and these are addressed by the minimalists. And the minimalists have a few different arguments, and I'm going to mention 3 of them here. The first one is that migration decisions are actually usually multi-causal, very complex, and often non-linear. So it is a bit tricky to put climate change and environmental problems in the center of this debate, because usually when people migrate, it's because of a whole range of lots of different kinds of factors that are interrelated, that are overlapping. Migration decisions are very multi-causal, and this makes it complex. And if we really want to understand people's migration behavior, we have to understand this whole range of different drivers that are working in tandem with each other. And we can call this conceptual fuzziness. It's a term coined by an author named Castles, I believe in 2002, and I think it's a pretty good term. Another critique of the maximalist narrative is that it's quite deterministic. I think many of us, certainly the ones of us who work in the social sciences, are very aware that people have agency. So when people are affected by climatic and environmental problems, they don't. This doesn't mean that they have to move. Often people make completely different decisions, and if they can adapt to local conditions, usually they will. This doesn't mean that this always happens, of course, but in most cases, if people have alternatives, they will at least try to stay. The problem with the maximalist narrative is that it kind of assumes that when people are affected by climatic problems, they will have to go on the move. But often this is not the case. People might have all sorts of ties to the land, ancestral ties, spiritual ties, subsistence ties, which make it so that they rather want to stay, and often they do. And then the third critique is the idea that not everyone who has to move will actually move, because a lot of people don't have the capacity to do so. It should be very clear that migration is usually a difficult undertaking. It's often expensive. And it happens to be so that the most vulnerable and poorest people on the planet often don't have the capacity to move to a different country. And this can culminate into what we can call trapped populations. These are people that maybe should move, maybe want to move, but can't move. And this is a very real thing that we should keep in mind. And it's a big problem. So in short, why do I prefer rather not to use terms like climate change migration, climate-induced migration, or environmental migration? Well, as you probably, these terms, they imply a very straightforward, very direct link between climate change and environmental problems on the one hand, and migration on the other hand. But in reality, it's much more complex, it's much more fuzzy. And I think that a term like climate and environment related migration is actually much more correct. It allows us to talk about these issues whilst also appreciating the complexity of the issue. This term was actually coined by Martin in 2016. You can see the citation below, and I thought it was very useful. Here's the conceptual framework that was used during the study. I borrowed a lot of it from other authors, and I added some things myself. We're mostly going to look at the left side of the framework today, and the right side I'm just going to mention now, but I'm not going to go too deep into it for the sake of time. So these authors, they were Knifton et al. In 2011, and also a report called Foresight, also from 2011. And as I said, I added some of my own things based on my findings. So let me just go through it very quickly. On the left side, you can see a number of categories of migration drivers. So people can move because of environmental problems, because of political pressures, demographic pressures, economic issues, social problems or conditions. And even without climate change and environmental change, these pressures very often already exist and may or may not cause migration. Environmental change, climate change, environmental pressures can then influence all these different categories of migration drivers. And may exacerbate them. However, as you can see on the on the right side of the diagram, the existence of migration drivers does not mean that migration always takes place. People have to go through a whole decision-making process that is influenced by lots of different factors. So, to name a few, we can look, for example, at intervening obstacles and facilitators. There are lots of factors that form obstacles to effective migration or that actually facilitate migration. There are various personal and household characteristics that play a role in people's decision making. For example, their age, their gender identity, education, wealth, adaptive capacity at home, etc. An important one, I think, is also prior experience of migration and of environmental hazards. If people have gone through these things before, this can often influence their decision making. And then there's also the expectations of the destination. What kind of things do people hope to gain by migrating? What do they expect to find? And these can be influenced by stories from other people through social networks, for example, people that are already in the destination country, people that have returned, media, internet, pop culture, etc. And then while going through those processes, people can actually decide to either stay or migrate. So it's not as straightforward that when people are exposed to environmental pressures, they will always leave. It's certainly not the case. So let me just go into some of the drivers of migration that I found in my research. There are a number of categories that were quite prominent, mostly economic drivers. These were actually mentioned by every single migrant that I spoke to, and I'm going to go into some more details about that in a minute. Political drivers were quite important as well, and various environmental drivers actually as well. I wasn't really sure if I was going to find it, but it actually was pretty clear. Now, environmental pressures were not the primary drivers for migration that I found, but they were still pretty relevant. And I found out that they can also affect people's migration decisions in very direct ways, as well as in indirect ways. And there were some other, like social, personal, and also demographic factors that played a role, but they were less prominent, so I'm not going to go into those today. And again, to reiterate, these factors usually intersect with each other, or they occur in tandem. I'm using these categories for the sake of practicality now, but you can't really see them as separate from each other. And I'll give some examples of that as well. So some of the more direct environmental drivers that I found included drought. Specifically in the case of Zimbabwe, this was something that was very prevalent, but also in some cases in Malawi. Malawian migrants mentioned it as well. Flooding, erratic rainfall, land degradation. This was very much the case in Malawi. I heard multiple people speak about this, and this is also backed up in literature. And also deforestation. So talking about economic drivers, high prices for foodstuffs and other essentials was something that was mentioned by almost everyone. Limited access to food and other essential products. And let me see, yeah, and also low employment prospects. And when people did find employment in their home countries, often they had very low wages. And also low access to healthcare. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I actually found out something quite interesting, and that is that quite a lot of pregnant women, specifically from Zimbabwe, tend to go to South Africa to give birth in South African public hospitals. And the reason that they do that is because in Zimbabwe, healthcare is very inaccessible and very expensive for most people. But in South Africa, they can get free healthcare in public hospitals when they want to give birth. And this is actually a reason for many people to cross the border. And I thought it was quite interesting. I didn't know about that before. And I also want to say something about remittances and the role that they played. This was also very interesting because obviously I think we can all imagine that when people suffer under low wages or low employment prospects back home, remittances can actually be an effective way to supplement these wages. And in fact, they did. But what I also found was that remittances often can play a role as in investments in agricultural adaptation strategies, and very often to deal with environmental problems back home. So here you can see that, again, these economic drivers and environmental problems cannot be viewed as separate from each other. People, for example, in Malawi, people from Malawi were speaking about problems with soil erosion, and this is a big problem in various parts of the country. And I read in literature that in the last few years, prices for fertilizer have also dramatically gone up at the same time. So people actually use these remittances to be able to buy fertilizer and deal with environmental pressures like soil degradation. Migrants from Zimbabwe were speaking about issues surrounding drought and using remittances to invest in irrigation systems back home. So here you can see again that these different issues are interlinked with each other, and I thought that was very interesting. A little bit on political drivers. Several were mentioned. For example, a poor public service, or sometimes even a complete lack of public services back home, poor infrastructure, lack of government support in times of crisis situations, including in times of environmental crises. For example, a migrant from Zimbabwe was speaking about how back in his home area a number of years ago, there were problems with floodings that actually swept away houses and roads, and people were suffering under that. And the government wasn't really doing anything about it, either because they didn't have the political will or the capacity to do so. And this is a big problem. And again, here's an example of how political problems intersect with environmental problems, and then may or may not cause people to move to a different country, to find opportunities elsewhere. Political persecution was also mentioned by various people, mostly from Zimbabwe. Instability and conflict, also in a number of cases. And then another interesting political factor that I found was the fact that existing power dynamics, which are often linked to politics, are often exacerbated by environmental pressures and can then lead to people making the decision to leave. So I think that for most of us, it's nothing new to hear that it's usually the people with the least amount of political power and influence, people with the least amount of capital, who are affected the most by climate change and environmental pressures. And this in turn can allow people with more power and capital to improve their positions even more, often at the cost of the more vulnerable. And there were some examples of this in my study as well. For example, I spoke to people from another community in Zimbabwe where there had been problems surrounding drought, which made it so that people in this community couldn't actually sustain themselves through smallholder agriculture anymore for a few months, and they were kind of forced to go to larger landowners and borrow or to rent pieces of land and rent agricultural equipment. And this actually put them into a position of dependency, and it obviously opens up all sorts of possibilities for exploitation. So again, an example of how, in this case, political problems and environmental problems overlap, intersect, influence each other, and then may or may not lead to migration decisions. And then a little bit on indirect environmental drivers, and then I'm almost going to conclude.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was just going to say it's as interesting as it is almost time to wrap
so
it up.
I'm almost finished. This is the last one,
right.
and then there's one short piece after this.
Sure. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. A little bit on indirect environmental drivers. So these are mostly, so when environmental problems are influencing migration decisions, these are in my research, at least, it turned out that they were mostly mediated through economic drivers for migration. So some of the economic problems that were mentioned before, I found some evidence that these that there are instances where these have been clearly influenced by environmental problems. For example, these environmental pressures have contributed to high food prices in several countries, constrained food availability, reduced economic growth, and we live in a global capitalist system, and this means that we need perpetual growth. And if an economy doesn't grow, of course, it's usually the poorest of the societies that are bearing the brunt, and also all the associated political unrest. To give one short example, I found evidence that in Malawi in 2018, low rainfall actually has been linked to a 20% increase in maize prices compared to the previous year. And yeah, high food prices were something that were mentioned by almost every migrant, also every migrant from Malawi. So I think that is pretty relevant. And then, yeah, I'm going to skip these slides. This is more about the migration decision-making process, but that's for another time. I just want to end with this quote. This is something that was said to me by Zimbabwean migrants who lived in Mooiplaas, the informal settlement close to Pretoria. And I just wanted to read it out to you because I thought it was quite striking and a little bit sad, but quite emblematic for the general mood that I found among most of my respondents. And this person said the following about the period before they left. By that time, the sun was heating. It was too hot at that time. We were not receiving enough rain like before. So how can you manage yourself to live on that side? If you try to farm, you can't get enough. We can't even get jobs. Do we just have to die in South Africa now? They want to kill us here. And it's quite grim, but when this person is speaking about they want to kill us here, they're talking about xenophobic violence in South Africa. This is a big problem, including for most of the migrants that I spoke to as part of the research. And yeah, they're also talking about trying to farm, but not really being able to manage themselves in that way. And that was something that came up quite often. And I think that is pretty emblematic. I think also that some of the results of my study show that climate change and environmental pressures do play a role. And as was also mentioned before, this is something that is not enough reflected in existing policies yet. And I think it should. And I want to end with that. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you. Given that the last presentation has dropped from the program, I think we can take short questions with short answers. I actually once wondered when you were listing, because my question is a bit specific and I see that David in the chat has a broader one, so that's why I'm using this order. I was just wondering, you say people don't necessarily name climate change as a reason for migration, but this is a well-known issue, right? People are not always aware that the reason they are suffering economically or financially has its origin in climate change. And so if you're looking at different potential reasons, and there's economic reasons, and then you have climate change, those are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. So would you say that is how did you see people were differing in the kind of awareness they had about climate change, and how that would reflect in the associations they made with their mobility pattern?
Well, it varied a little bit. Yeah, as you said, for most people, this was not something that they brought up right away. In some cases, they did, surprisingly. I must say, though, I very specifically didn't specifically ask about climate change. Often for two reasons. First of all, because as you said, for many people, it can be a bit difficult to identify when something is happening because of climate change. But secondly, actually, in general, it's very hard to say if an event, an environmental pressure event, is caused by climate change. So I want to be a bit careful with that. I did ask questions about moments where people were affected by environmental pressures, like droughts, for example, and floodings. But whether or not those are caused by climate change is not always relevant, I think. It is a fact that these kinds of pressures are going to happen more and more in the near future, if they are, and they already are. So I think if we understand how people respond to these kinds of pressures, I think we can also infer from that what we might expect in the future. Speaking about climate in general, it varied a little bit, but people did bring it up, and maybe they weren't speaking about climate change, but they did talk about droughts, floodings, and those
changing weather patterns. Yeah, and then maybe to close, David in the chat was asking if a new world order debate could address these migration issues. It's a broad question, but I still wanted to present it.
I'm not sure what David means by a new world order debate.
Yeah, maybe people in the audience cannot take the word. So if you want to clarify it, but maybe we can take the question for the coffee break. David, I would propose we meet in the coffee break anyway, because we seem to have some common interests, and I would propose the same to you, Robin. So maybe we should go, if there's a Joburg coffee room, I don't know. They're all the big
Cape Town one I saw. I don't know about you.
All right, let's meet in the Cape Town room then. Yes, after the break.
Cool.
Okay, so then thanks a lot, and